Hi! For today I will be drawing two pixel maps, one that is inspired by the hand-drawn maps in classic fantasy books like The Wheel of Times or The Lord of the Rings, and a second one in the style of retro video games like A Link to the Past or Super Mario. So let's begin! First of all, I will play you these two designs side by side, so we could just compare them as we go. For both maps, I started off identical with an 80 by 100 pixel canvas, with a simple rectangle in the middle, which is where our island will be. I had no specific shape in mind here, so I simply cut apart the rectangles to make them a bit more interesting looking. And on the left I tried to create a more organic or natural looking coastline, while the right side is more linear and symmetrical. Also I tried to use a very distinct set of colors for each map. So the fantasy map will be all beige and browns, and the video game map will be mainly blues and greens. And also a lot more colorful just in general. The next key difference was perspective. Here we have a traditional flat top-down view on the one hand and a more three-dimensional view on the other, with the islands rising out of the sea. The sea itself is very different as well. For the video game map I actually tried to create some kind of water, with waves and a foamy surf breaking at the shore. The fantasy map on the other hand is rather stylized to look more like an actual map, with a simple grid and only a few wavy lines to suggest water. With the basic shape ready, I drew my first region, which was a mountain range on the north end of the island. And here I tried to use the same stylistic cues that I already had established. So a hand-drawn and natural look on the left and a more symmetrical look on the right. You can see how I actually drew individual mountains for the fantasy map, while the video game map is very stylized and repetitive, just like regular assets are used in the actual games. I took the same approach for the next region, which had a lot of hills rolling gently across the landscape. And I guess you can already see what I'm doing here, so we start high up in the north and slowly work our way down to the southern shore. So next I cut the island in half by adding a long river running west to east, and this was rather simple for the fantasy map because it's basically just a dark winding line, but for the video game map it was a bit more complex with the perspective and all. Also I really wanted to include this little waterfall in the west just to add a little whimsy to the map. And this worked rather well on the right, but not so much on the left, so I decided to keep it simple over there. For the lower half of the maps I finally made some trees. And here the video game map definitely had the upper hand, because for one I had more colors to work with, and also I felt like I could play a bit more with the size of my trees. And thus I could really make distinguishable designs for my leafy trees as well as my evergreens. For the fantasy map, however, I only had my three colors to work with, and in addition I did not want my trees to get too big in relation to the mountains in the north. So in the end, broadleaves and pine trees, only differ by 1 or 2 pixels. Honestly, let me know if you can actually see any kind of difference here, or if those trees just look exactly the same to you. As a final element, I really wanted to include a landmark in the southwest. And while I could be rather playful on the right side, the fantasy map proved challenging again, mainly because of the fewer colors and also the general size of elements on this map. Ironically, a more complex tower with a ring wall and windows was far easier to create and looked way better than the simple tower I had tried to make in the first place. Now, with all elements in place, I started to improve the coastlines. And here I used two different approaches. For the fantasy map, I used simple dithering to indicate elevation for the land as well as the sea. For the video game map, on the other hand, I drew a couple of beaches all around the map to create an additional layer and incorporate a bit more perspective into the map. Also, I felt like I needed a little more depth for the fantasy map, so I decided to introduce an additional color to bump up the contrast just a little bit. and while I was pretty pleased with how this map had turned out, I did not feel quite the same way about the other one. It just wasn't as refined. So let's just give a little more love and care to our video game map. First, I tried an alternative for the water by using straight lines instead of waves. And I also changed how the surf rolled up against the shore. Then I started refining the plateaus, and here I did a couple of things. First, I added directional lighting coming in from the left, and I tried to increase the contrast just in general. Then I made a few variations to the edges to make them more organic looking, while still keeping this classic retro game aesthetic alive. Finally, I added drop shadows on the right side to create a little more three-dimensionality. I hope that's a word, I guess you know what I mean. And on the same note, I tried to increase the contrast between light and shadow all over the map, which really did provide some necessary depth and plasticity to this design. Then I got sidetracked a bit and I built this happy little cliff here in the lower half of the map before continuing with refining the contrast and shadows all over the place. But then I got distracted again because I finally committed to the simple linear waves, which I also used to create a kind of vignette around the entire map. This not only reduced the noise, but also framed the entire island rather nicely. After that, I provided a few finishing touches to the whole shadow and contrast thing, and because I was still missing something, I added a couple more silly elements, like a torch on this little island over there, a simple ladder next to the tower, because how else would you go down to the beach, and a hidden treasure chest in the deep forest, because treasure is always nice to have. And with all this, I'm finally as happy with this map as I am with the fantasy map, and seeing them side by side like this, I honestly don't have a clear favorite now. I think they both had their flaws and merits, but it was a real fun exercise and I feel like I've learned a lot from it. Anyhow, let me know what you think. I hope I see you again for the next video, and until then, keep your whimsy, stay creative, and bye.